that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And welcome to today's edition of the Open Word podcast. And of course, our regular guest, Professor Clive Thomas, is going to be on today. I would like to welcome all of you, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from inside of Guyana, or you're joining us from a wider Caribbean. Those of you who are coming to us from North America, from Europe, and I always seem to forget those of you in South America. I'm so accustomed to the Caribbean thing. I'm talking about Suriname, and of course you all are CARICOM too. And those of you in French Guyana, and I noticed some people are joining us from Brazil. Welcome to Politics 101, our podcast, Politics 101 podcast, the Open Word. And Professor Clive Thomas is here this week again to help us to make some sense of some of these economic issues, these issues of economics and development and transformation. You know, we're hearing all of these things. Thanking all of you for the feedback that we got on the program on inflation and prices and so on and so forth. Would like to thank all of you for the feedback that I got. And as you notice, we had to rebroadcast that program. We had to rebroadcast that program on the weekend. Thank you all for tuning in. Those of you who missed it the first time and ask for a replay. As we said, we want to make sure that we have the kind of diversity of ideas and discourse on the program, broadening our horizon, giving people something else to think about. And, you know, when I talked with Professor Clive Thomas before we did that edition, we felt that it was something that was so important for us to engage in, and we were not wrong because of the feedback we got from you. Welcome to all of you to this week. And this week we are going to touch on something that we've teased, you know, as Guyana has become a big player, if you will. And we are a big player. We are a big player, you know, as I said in an earlier edition of our program. Teacher George would say, are we not ground dove no more? We're eagle, fly high, and so on, you know. And yes, it means that there are going to be logical spin-offs from the fact that, you know, our economy, they're saying, has grown 60-something%. Now, we know that that does not necessarily translate into development of people. And we have been saying here that it does not automatically translate. That this is where the hand of the government comes in. You know, Professor Thomas the last time talked about the hand of the market. Here's where the hand of the government comes in. How do you take that GDP growth and turn it into real development of people? Because that's where the transformation is going to come. And I am glad that we have been able to inject that into the discussion. The fact of the matter is that we are going to become at least a hemispheric player, a regional player. And so the issue arises, how we gonna move? We introduced here Professor Clive Thomas, talked about our possible entry into the BRICS group. And those of us who have been reading, we're talking here about the grouping that includes Brazil South Africa and China and so forth. I notice a whole host of countries are lining up to join BRICS. And we raised the question here of multipolarity. And some of you did ask, what about OPEC? And then I think Mr. Jack Dio and the government themselves have begun to talk about OPEC and these groupings. So we're going to have Professor Thomas really expand on that issue today. Where do we go? How do we move? Do we move towards OPEC? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What are the pressures on us to get into these groupings or to stay away from these groupings? Some people are speculating that Secretary of State Blinken's visit a week ago had something to do with how we move. Is this going to bring us into the trade war, the Cold War between China and the United States? Is Blinken concerned about how we move, whether we are going to join OPEC or we're going to go in the direction of BRICS? So we're moving into geopolitics, not the geopolitics that is concerned about regime change and so on that occurred, but we're talking about the geopolitics as a result of us being a petro state. So with those introductory remarks, let me bring in Professor Clive Thomas. Professor Thomas, how are you today?
I'm fine, David. Good evening.
Thank you. And as I indicated our last program, we got so many requests for it to be replayed that we had to run it twice this past week.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yes. We propose to talk today about how we move, because one of the things that you have taught me and taught our audience is whether we like the government or whether we are in the opposition or wherever, the fact of the matter is that a country growing at the rate at which Guyana is growing cannot be poo-pooed. It is a real thing, and it has consequences for what happens inside of Guyana and consequences for how Guyana locates itself in the wider world.
Wider world, yeah.
Yes, the wider world, to use your column, Guyana and the wider world. So, Professor Thomas, are you surprised that the discussion seems to be moving in that direction? How do we move in the wider world?
No, David, I'm far from surprised. You might not remember, but since back in 2018, I'd written an article addressing this matter. And then again in 2021, I revisited it, and I argued that there are three strategic decisions that Guyana has to make before the middle of the 2030s. One of these was whether or not to join OPEC. You see, the levels at which we are going to be producing oil requires us to take a strategic view of the oil market and the role we propose to play in it. The other decision we have to make, I think, is whether we should operate as what I call a swing producer. That is, entering the market to try to balance it, to ensure that we are at all times benefiting from better prices than would normally prevail. And the third decision which we need to make is whether we set up a national oil company. Because right now, the operatorship of the oil that we're producing is largely in the hands of Exxon and its partners. Unless we insinuate the state, which is the only agency in Guyana that has the resources to do that, into the operations of the oil sector, we won't have a strategic position to carry from the inside, which means that the OPEC decisions and all those other decisions that might have to be made in terms of the strategic role we want to play as a global player will be dominated by Exxon's view of its needs and its requirements as a major oil producer, supermajor. So those three strategic decisions, I don't think we should try or try to make the decision early up, like right now, because we don't have the capacity to do the thinking and nor to execute it. But I think it's something that must be brought into the discussion, and I'm glad that you are doing it so that we can ensure that these thoughts are exchanged at this early period, so that by the middle of the 2030s, we will be in a position to make a decision that is the best decision for Guyana. That's my view of how important this thing is.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why, even though it's some 7 years ago, away from here, more than half a decade, its urgency is really right now, because we need that time in order to think through all the issues. And to be able to do that, we need to go back in time. We need to go back to the formation of OPEC back in 1960. When the OPEC was formed, it had three broad aims. One was to coordinate the policies of the oil-producing countries. The second aim was to ensure that national control of the oil companies became part of the policies of the oil producers. And that led to the creation of state oil companies. So right now, the production of oil globally is not dominated by oil majors, as some people write every day. It's dominated by state producing agencies. And OPEC over this period has also expanded itself from probably around 60 members now to include associate members. And also it's been described in the world as OPEC Plus, because it includes major superpowers in it as well, like Russia, which is a major producer of oil. OPEC at this point in time is very different from what it was in the formation. Because in the formation, the aim was to try to redress the global imbalance in the distribution of income, wealth, employment, resources between the developed world and the underdeveloped world. What OPEC discovered very early on when it was formed in 1960, a few years later, or that's a decade and a half later, when it became powerful, that it was not having enough control over prices. That meant that the cartel element of OPEC, that is the control over supply, had to be more flexibly used in order to ensure that they could get a fair price in the market for oil, because in those days oil was less than $3 a barrel, you won't believe it. That they can get a fair price for their oil, and in so doing, a fair return on the capital that was invested in the oil industry. So that continued for many years. But after the Great Recession of 2008, the OPEC countries changed their strategy, because the developed countries began to realize that they were becoming a major player in the global environment. In fact, for the first time, they began to realize that the sovereign wealth funds that the OPEC producers had created, and which were really created by state oil companies, were subject to political direction. And they did not want this type of capital to circulate in any dominant fashion in the global environment. And so after 2008, a lot of effort has been made to try to stifle OPEC. In fact, you may not know it, but there's a law that has been passed in the US Congress called NOPEC, NOPEC. That is no producing, exporting cartels. which tries to make the creation of a cartel by an oil exporter illegal within the United States. That law is still on the books.
Wow.
Trump vetoed it, of all people. He had to veto
Yes.
it.
Uh-huh.
And that bill is still there, so it's a very hostile environment, because that bill will cripple a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, because they hold their assets in oil, in U.S. currency. Their assets earned from the sale of oil. It's all in U.S. currency. It's all held in U.S. institutions, more predominantly so. And the risk of expropriation or cancellation because they're illegal is a high risk. So you can see, therefore, that as time has progressed, instead of welcoming OPEC, it has grown to create a great set of hostilities. And this has been exaggerated in recent times because of the conflict between Saudi Arabia and the United States following the murder of Khashoggi,
Yes.
the journalist, and also following the war in Yemen, which has been particularly brutal and has violated lots of human rights. So that's a very complex environment in which we have to navigate. And that is why it needs all this careful thought for Guyana to decide how to proceed. There's no doubt in my mind that without the existence of OPEC, the Middle Eastern powers would not be what they are today. The mobilization and creation of the national oil companies and their coordination and working as a supply cartel played an important part in distributing the income and oil and the income and wealth created by oil. There can be no doubt about that. The days, therefore, of that type of redistribution and transfer of wealth and income from the developed countries where the super majors lived or resided to the OPEC countries has ended, because now there's too many institutions that have been set up to control the use and the allocation of the funds raised from the sale of oil in the global marketplace. So we now have to face a different type of OPEC from the one that existed. At this point in time, the OPEC plays an important role in the macroeconomic management of the globe to ensure that these imbalances don't lead to inflation, don't lead to world collapse and depression. It also plays an important part in the geopolitics of the world, which is nowhere better expressed than the geopolitics of the Russian-Ukraine war. So this situation and this circumstance now needs fresh thinking.
Fresh thinking.
But you should not dismiss the initial benefits that came from the formation of OPEC.
Of OPEC.
It was a dream. It was a dream of every developing country. When I was at college,
right,
we were all hoping that the Middle Eastern powers will countries would seize control of their oil industries and move away from the dominance of the oil majors. That happened, and we should acknowledge it. And that was an important development.
Yes, and I've put on the screen there an article you wrote in July of last year.
Yeah.
And it's there. It's a change of my previous OPEC recommendations warranted. And as I read through that article, you raise a very important question. And that is that if we were to join OPEC, it means that we would be subject to certain rules and regulations that govern OPEC. So, for example, when OPEC says that it is reducing the amount of oil it's putting on the market, as it is doing right now in relation to Russia and Saudi Arabia, it means that Guyana would be bound by those rules. Is that?
Of course.
Yes.
Of course. But remember, they're not doing it to hurt themselves. They're doing it to raise the price.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
they're hoping to get more benefit out of doing that than they would have gotten if they'd allowed the production to continue. So the calculation is being made all the time.
Yes.
But from
So,
the point of view of a company like Exxon,
uh-huh.
if they're operating the oil industry, they won't want to have that fluctuation taking place at all. They'd be unhappy. So this decision can be taken if it continues with OPEC. Well, the decision to join OPEC can be taken if we continue with Exxon being the sole operator and decision maker
Yeah.
for production of oil. So we have to move to more national involvement in the decision making of the oil that is really our resources, and
Ah,
which they're not contesting that we're the owners, but they're the operatorship. So what we're trying to do is to elevate that operatorship into part ownership, so that we
uh-huh.
also involve ourselves in decision. Because you have to
Ah,
remember, these oil companies operate with two sets of laws. Well, I should say three. They operate with the laws of their own country from which they come. They operate with public law in their countries, as well as public law in our countries, that is the law governing the state and institutions of the state. And they also operate with company law, both in their countries and in our countries. And their primary responsibility is to operate within company law. Many of our people think that you can just tell a company what to do, but you can't. Not in well-regulated markets. It's like I saw on a paper somebody advising Blinken when he came here to tell Exxon to do better.
yes, I saw
I
that.
mean,
Right.
I think he would privately laugh to himself. He said, what sort of country and they don't know that we can't do that? He daren't risk telling Exxon what to do because the state cannot intervene in the company's activities like that. They have to go through where the law and regulation allow them to do that. Biden can't call no company and tell them that and let it be known. He will last as the president for the rest of that year.
That's right. That's right. Right. Right.
Mm.
But in any case, the Supreme Court in the United States
Yeah, but voted down, yeah.
voted that down in several cases as it relates to coal and the coal industry.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
he voted it down. So see why our choice of whether to go into OPEC or not, you're saying, is governed not just by the whims and fancies of our government, but you're saying there are other factors that have to be taken into consideration,
Yeah,
such
and I
as
think
the fact that Exxon is the sole operator, if you will,
at
um,
this point in time,
at this point in time. And so you are recommending that we wait, right?
I recommend we wait. And I also recommend, because I think the decision that should be broadly national,
Mhm.
I recommend also consultation so we take a national position on it. Because you don't want one government coming in supporting OPEC and then another one comes in and leaves. Because OPEC has had that experience of countries joining it and leaving it and rejoining, depending on when and how the fortunes go. So you have to make a careful evaluation of how far and how successful you think OPEC can be in meeting your our expected needs at true time. And we have to make a decision that all be committed to following at least for the foreseeable future. So it become a binding commitment of the state and not just of the party in power.
Yeah.
That would
Yeah.
be my recommendation.
Your recommendation. Let's see why if I can take you back a little bit to Trinidad back in the 1970s.
Mm.
And you can correct me, but my understanding was Trinidad did not join OPEC, but they benefited
Of course,
um,
they
from OPEC, OPEC's intervention into the global market. Talk a little bit about that.
well, of course, they never joined OPEC, but of course, as an oil producer, they benefited from the increase in prices.
Yeah.
We also benefited from being a neighbor of Venezuela, because remember Chavez used to be an important supplier of oil to us in the hard times,
Yes.
the hard times, when we couldn't get oil and we couldn't get basic foods and all that. So we have a relationship with OPEC that has been pretty contributory to Guyana's survival over the years. Because Chavez had initiated a scheme for the Caribbean as a whole,
The Petro-Caribbean scheme.
the Petro-Caribbean thing, and he was facilitating oil at a time when we could not afford to import it because we weren't earning enough foreign exchange. So OPEC has always been at its heart, in some way or the other, intending to be a revolutionary organization, supporting the national interest of poor people. But that itself became transformed through history, as you will expect that to happen. And as those countries became richer, their ambitions grew, and they took on wider visions. That is why I think it is important for us also to learn the lessons of OPEC. Right now, OPEC has such gigantic funds in their own national resource funds that they're buying in, as you can see from Saudi Arabia, into the sports markets of the leading industrial countries of the world.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the only industry they really didn't take over yet is NBA. But
Mm-hmm.
everywhere else, they're making penetrations in football in Europe, in golf in the United States. And I think that's an excellent strategic decision. Because come what we say, as people's livelihoods expand over time going forward, for as far as we can foresee, that's hundreds of years, entertainment and sport will always be an integral element of their expenditure. And if they can stake a claim in those areas, they will stake an important claim on an industry whose contribution to wealth and incomes over time will be rivaling the best that you can think of. The other area in which they're trying to be an important investor is digital matters, particularly in space. Because I think I mentioned in one of these programs before, early on, that one of the countries, I can't remember which one it is right now, UAE, I think, is also trying to invest in space and to have space missions. So when you get to that stage, you have to have your vision of investments the way you want to see your country go, rise in scale. And I think it's important for Guyana in making this decision about OPEC to also consider and envision Guyana as a scale and level of operation and the rest of the Caribbean that may be unthinkable now, but will be also important to foresee as a potential over the very long run. So it widens our vistas and expands the vision with which we see the rest of the world and see our environment in.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why I think the oil discovery is more than just a discovery of wealth. It's also a discovery that gives us a chance to have a new vision, a new sense of contributing to humanity. And I think of slave dependence, I think that is and one of the ironies of history. And I'm happy about it.
Yeah. See, why is there a hierarchy in OPEC, or is there a kind of democratic pecking order, if you will? If there's something as a democratic pecking order, because pecking order itself suggests hierarchy. But is there a hierarchy, like countries have influence based on the scale of production, reserves, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a hierarchy like that. I think the only reason why America would never be at the top of history as it is now if it was based in democracy.
Yeah, right.
Because that you're facing, look at the country with literally its president tried to mount a coup against its own country, the country he was the president of. That's a remarkable development. And people are underrated because they don't talk about it. They talk about it a lot in the States, but they get easily diverted to acting and exchanging as if this never happened,
Yeah.
as if it's not happening right now. But I think one of the greatest potential dangers that I can see in the horizon is if that president gets back in power and his retribution, as he said he's going to do, that transforms this hemisphere in a way you'd never imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, does OPEC try to recruit members to its ranks? So take a place
Yeah,
like
they do. But most countries apply because you have to qualify, and to qualify, you have to be an oil producer of
right.
significance. I think they've been overcharged to Guyana. Give me hints. The Guyana, they should consider it. I've seen that in the various international media reports that overtures have been made to Guyana. I can't verify that they're true because the government here doesn't give releases on those such matters. But there are overtures that they have been reported overtures made to the government of Guyana. So I know that is why it's a good topic to discuss now. So I know there's some level of discussion that must be taking place behind the scenes. But the time is essentially at a critical juncture because I think we have to make a decision and within the next 7 years.
Within the next 7 years, Professor Clive Thomas here talking to us about OPEC, the oil producers organization that has been in existence since the late 1950s. And as we are seeing in the world news in recent times, that they do determine a lot of what happens on the global market as far as oil is concerned. And we saw both Russia and Saudi Arabia cutting back on their oil exports. Professor Thomas, how is that? You said that they're doing that to maximize prices for themselves.
The global price. The world market price they're trying to influence.
They try to influence.
Because they control so much of supply, I think 70% odd.
Right.
That if they maneuver the supply, they can maneuver the price. Because supply and demand got to balance.
Right.
So if less oil is on the market, the tendency is for more prices to rise.
Right, more prices to rise. Now, Guyana is just down the road from the United States of America, which of course is going to be affected by that decrease in supply and
but America's a big producer, don't forget that.
Yes, right. How are we going to benefit or not benefit as Guyana from this new development?
Well, I think what you have to gauge is whether it gives you the security that you think you need. And can it give you, in general, a better price than you would get? And there's also what is known in economics as a free rider.
Right.
I don't want to raise, you could be manipulative or opportunistic and just let them do it and you benefit from the increases.
Right.
They're the free rider issues. Yeah. And I suppose if we have to have a national discussion, this type of consideration will arise. To what extent, as we are so small, let's play a free rider role.
Right. No, no,
I
no,
wouldn't
no.
oppose that as a general solution either.
As a general solution. Now, of course, Guyana gets its share of the oil and then it sells it. This is opposed to the Exxon selling its
Yeah,
share.
yeah.
Right. Talk a little bit about that and the rise of prices on the world market. Can we, for example, when we get our share, can we sell at a different price from, let's say, Exxon?
Yeah, yeah. Our price and their price is not connected. It's
Okay.
connected only to the extent that the world market price is the ruling price.
Uh-huh. 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 Uh-huh.
And this price moved significantly in 2021. The average price we got was around $50 per barrel. And in 2022, it was around 100. So you
Yes.
can see the big difference it makes.
Uh-huh. Of course, we're talking here about prices being accrued to Guyana because, of course, there's something called the market and the global market. We, of course, in the WPA, we have always stressed that in addition to what is coming into Guyana, we are equally or perhaps more concerned with the distributive aspect. So we don't want to give the impression here that we are just talking about how much is coming into Guyana or how much is not coming into Guyana. We want to balance that with how it's being distributed because we think that in these discussions it can't be one or the other. And even as I say that, Professor Clive Thomas, there was a report in the Kaito News a couple of days ago in which a panel was discussing Guyana's approach to development in the era of oil as a petro state. And one of the presenters zeroed in on poverty as a very important factor in how Guyana spends its petrodollars. Of course, the discussion was presented as poverty or the infrastructure. We know that the Guyana government is putting a lot of emphasis on infrastructural investments and little or no emphasis on issues such as poverty. This presenter we are talking about, he came down on the side of poverty, wasn't too excited about infrastructure investment. Where do you stand in that debate?
Well, of course, we prioritize poverty, but we also have to do both because we won't develop the country given the way in which it is spatially distributed without building up our infrastructure, our roads, our waterways, all these things have to be regulated and developed. So we see a complement for both. So that is why whenever we talk about direct alleviation of poverty, we set a cap on the amount of resources from the state going towards those activities. And that cap is guided by what is needed to remove people from poverty. It's not an arbitrary gap. It's a gap based on what we figure the size of the gap between the income they need to survive above the poverty level and the income they are receiving now. So we try to bring a scientific approach towards its resolution. So it's not
And
an
of
either
course,
or situation to us.
right, right. And of course, there's a differentiation between handouts, which
Of
we are
course.
not totally opposed to, but we are saying handouts can't do the kind of lead to the kind of development that we are talking about, the kind of
In
human
fact, it can
development.
encourage underdevelopment because
Exactly.
it's seen as you serve in the government and the government doesn't have to serve you. So governmental efficiency and all that no longer matters. What matters is how much of the handouts you can get. So we develop what we call a rentier state, where people are benefiting from handouts and all revenues and the opportunities we have are seen as the product and to be used for the distribution of and sale of unworthy benefits around the country, rather than a calculated attempt by our nation to solve its own problems in a rational way.
And of course, one of the points made there was that the government approach seems to be more targeted towards keeping itself in power
Yeah,
rather
of course.
than developing. Now, that's an interesting argument on the face of it. Uh, uh, but don't governments? We know governments naturally try to keep themselves in power. But there seems to be a suggestion that there has to be some point where that old transactional approach stops and development begins.
Well, the transactional approach can paper over many cracks
They-
because we're talking about billions of US dollars relative to a country which is just 4 or 5 billion US dollars itself. It means there's a disproportion in the size of the benefits that we can get out of oil. That is creating a need to be more rational and to avoid the traditional approaches.
Professor Clive Thomas, as we close out, there's been a recent talk about the doing something about the Guyana dollar as it relates to the American dollar. What's the term you use there?
Appreciation, depreciation,
Yes.
dollarization.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there are many different issues involved. First of all, there's the issue of dollarization.
Right.
Many people feel that we don't need a national currency, that we just let the US dollar circulate as a national currency. And some countries have done that. We don't need to have a national currency, become a dollarized regime, and the US dollar circulates in lieu of any other currency. That's one extreme. There's also the other view that the rate has been so depreciated over time when we were in the bad times,
Right.
210 to 1, that its appreciation is warranted. So that's another view. But appreciating it has its own problems. Because once you begin to appreciate it, and its value relative to the US begins to change, people also change their decisions about how they it could lead to speculation. It could create all sorts of difficulties. So it's something that has to be thought out carefully.
Something that
It's
has
not
to
a
be thought
simple
out.
matter. Yeah.
Right. And of course, those of you in the audience here are picking up that we're talking about lowering the Guyana dollars as it relates.
But you're appreciating it if you give it
You
less.
appreciated it, yes.
Less to one US.
Yes. But as you were saying, Professor, that there are a lot of factors that
course,
are
yeah.
involved in that. But of course, there is a benefit when you have a stable currency. I mean, we have the EC
dollar.
the EC dollar, and we have the Barbadian dollar, which are pretty stable. Barbados 2-1, and the EC I think 2.67 or something. They're about to the American dollar. And how has that benefited the Eastern Caribbean countries and Barbados to have that kind of stable?
Well, they're very proud of stability because they rely a lot on tourism.
Yeah.
So a fixed rate of interest allows them to sell their services easily. But at the same time, it also raises the price of services in many of those countries.
Yeah.
And one of the attractions we benefit from as a country with a low exchange rate, in the sense that we have to give 210 Guyanese dollars for one US dollar, is that it entices tourism, and it entitles visitors, attracts them to come to Guyana.
Yeah.
Because a little can go further. A little can go a long way, as you see. A couple $100 US, you can feel pretty happy in Guyana.
Yeah. Yeah, Professor Clive Thomas here, walking us through some of these issues that we encounter every day, and linking it to Guyana and the wider world. We are talking today, of course, about Guyana's potential membership of OPEC, and whether we should rush into that kind of arrangement. We should think it through. Professor Thomas really giving us the pros and the cons here today. Professor, anything that you want to say on this issue that I've not asked you about?
No, but I would like to emphasize the fact that this legislation exists, which many people are surprised to know is
Yes.
no PEC. And the law has actually gotten through the Congress. And it's the president that vetoed it.
Yes,
so it shows
yes,
the
yes.
stakes at play.
Yes, 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 yes. I thought that totally means a kind of Helms-Burton kind of law. You know that the Helms-Burton laws, prohibited countries in the hemisphere from dealing with Cuba, and the United States can sanction countries that deal with Cuba. I had no idea that law prohibiting membership of OPEC had really made its way through Congress and was vetoed by all people. Trump.
Yeah. The ironies of history.
Oh, yes. Professor Thomas, last week I asked you to reflect on the U.S. Secretary of State's visit to Guyana. You gave us some preliminary remarks. You would have had a week to think more about it. Any new thoughts?
I think you mentioned some of them that I would have mentioned.
Yes.
I think you recognize the importance of the oil in terms of his visit. And I think that is probably perhaps the most important. That's just my personal view.
Yes, yes.
I also think that they probably have some concerns too about national stability.
Yeah.
And the concern about maybe the representations that are being made overseas about the treatment of the African Guyanese population and the concerns that the government might not be handling this in a democratic way. I think some of those concerns have reached their decision makers for the Democratic Party. In fact, I'm pretty sure that has happened.
Yeah. Interest in that regard, the meeting. Yes, the meeting between the Secretary of State and the opposition leader was significant. We've learned since that the government was taken by surprise by that meeting. They didn't know about it. Comments there? Is that positive?
Well, everything that happens in a visit like that is significant.
Yes.
Those things are never by accident. From my living experience, I know those things are never accidents. And they were sending signals to the persons who should take the signals.
Yes. Professor Clive Thomas, thank you again for coming through again this week, and as we say in local parlance, enlightening us on a number of these issues and keeping our people informed. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Yes, we have the new development of the movement of all peoples throughout the Caribbean. Yes. Immigration. It's a new development. They're hoping to bring it on stream next year, as early as next year, and so perhaps the next
that should have happened long ago, David.
Yeah.
40 years old.
Right. Right. So next week we'll talk a little bit about that, because I know that's something that you have spent your working life, advocating for. So it's not surprised that you said it should have happened a long time ago. I was on a program this morning in Antigua, and I was over the moon, welcoming it. And there was an activist from Antigua who was on the program with me, and he welcomed it like I did, but he wasn't, said, be careful, this thing, I've heard it decades ago. And the question is whether there is the will to pursue it. And he made an interesting point. And that is that the Eastern Caribbean, because of their experience of with the OECS, they are more in tune with that kind of thing. But it's the Big Four, and that with the Barbados Labour Party in power and the PNM in Trinidad in power, that's good. But he made a reference to the skepticism about regional integration whenever the Jamaican Labour Party has been in power, and reference to our PPP being in power. They were fearful that those two parties that are in power now may try to slow down the process.
The process, yeah.
Yes. And I found it an interesting perspective. Yes. But we'll talk more about that next week.
We'll talk more about that next week, yeah.
Yes.
And the force is a history too. You can't underestimate that.
Right.
After a long time, things need to fall in place.
Yes. In my response, I did say the change situation in Guyana with the coming of Guyana into petro-state status could be the game changer.
Yeah, it is.
Of Guyana.
That is why I always urge that we are preemptive, that we are active, rather than passive with this oil money.
Yes.
So I like to see a more activist state, activist development state, pursuing Caribbean integration now.
Yes. Professor Clive Thomas, thank you very much again.
Well, don't mention it, sir.
Professor Clive Thomas, they're one of my mentors, growing up with the likes of Thomas and Rodney and Rupnarain and Guyana and Dai and all the others, very early you got introduced not just to party politics in Guyana, which we are all part of, but also to some of these dimensions of our being, the regional integration, Guyana and the wider world. I remember Professor Clive Thomas did a column called Economics for Everyone. And I remember that was in, because the open word that we are using here is taken from a new sheet that the WPA did in the 1980s called Open Word. And I remember Professor Thomas had a column there every week, Economics for Everyone. And so you're introduced to these concepts because they become so important in articulating the domestic politics, because, Guyana is not an island, and our economy is not an island. And I have found that the more one gets a grasp of our place in the region, the hemisphere, and the world, one gets a deeper appreciation of our own domestic situation. I want to say that is invaluable, and I'm glad to pass some of that on to our audience. I want to thank you all for staying with us yet again, and to, as I always say, love is the watchword. And as the Black Stallion says, all of us came on some ship from some place. And if we push one common intention for we women and we children, then we are going to make real the promise of emancipation. See you all next time.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children.